This, of course, came as a huge shock, and William and I have been doing everything we can to process and manage this privately for the sake of our young family.
Something has shifted behind the polished silence of the royal stage, where every gesture is measured and every word is meant to soothe. Yet this time, the calm fractured. What began as a reportedly sharp, deeply personal remark has spiraled into something far more explosive, an alleged public insult, followed by a legal move no one saw coming. Inside those guarded circles, reactions are said to be swift, tense, and unusually divided. But how did a private clash escalate into a courtroom battle so quickly? Do you think this was a calculated move or a moment that went too far? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what unfolds next. The quiet distance behind palace doors. Carol Middleton never stepped into the orbit of the British royal family by heritage or inherited privilege. Her path was built differently, through steady work, sharp instinct, and a quiet determination that carried her family from a modest life in Berkshire into the grand halls of Buckingham Palace. Those who have closely followed her journey often describe her as the unseen force behind her children's confidence, especially her daughter, Catherine, Princess of Wales. Long before the world began watching, Carol seemed to understand that entering royal life would demand more than elegance. It would require endurance. Yet beneath the polished surface of royal tradition, acceptance was never guaranteed. Within certain circles tied to Queen Camilla, there existed a subtle but unmistakable divide. It was not expressed through open rejection, but through something far more refined: distance. A kind of social precision that revealed itself in small gestures, invitations that never arrived, greetings that felt formal rather than warm, and conversations that ended just a little too soon. For some within that world, Carol's presence carried an unspoken challenge, a reminder that the boundaries of tradition were shifting. This tension quietly unfolded during the grand preparations of 2011, when Prince William and Catherine prepared to marry at Westminster Abbey. It was a moment filled with global attention, but behind the scenes, it became an early test of belonging. Carol approached the process with care, offering ideas gently and respecting the intricate system of royal protocol. Still, insiders suggest that her contributions often met an invisible barrier. Nothing was ever dismissed outright, yet somehow her voice rarely carried weight. One particular moment lingered. Carol had shared a thoughtful suggestion for a more personal detail of the post-ceremony celebration, something rooted in her understanding of her daughter. Within a day, the idea quietly disappeared, replaced without discussion. There was no direct explanation, no formal acknowledgement, just a passing comment from someone else, as though the change had always been intended. She did not protest. She adapted. To those watching closely, however, the shift was visible in the smallest ways. A brief stillness, a tightening expression quickly controlled. It was the silent language of someone learning the rules of a world that never needed to explain itself. And in that silence, a deeper story was unfolding, one not of conflict, but of quiet resilience in the face of a system slow to open its doors. As Catherine, Princess of Wales, stepped into Westminster Abbey on April 29, 2011, the world saw perfection, but beyond the ceremony lay a quieter, more complex reality. What hidden tensions and unspoken pressures surrounded this historic moment? And how did Carol Middleton truly experience the day that changed everything forever? A seat at the palace, a place apart. The world stood still on April 29, 2011, as Catherine, Princess of Wales, moved through the grand doors of Westminster Abbey, wrapped in light, expectation, and history. To millions watching, it felt like a perfect moment, timeless, almost unreal. Yet just beyond the glow of cameras and applause, a quieter, more complicated story unfolded, one that few truly noticed. For Carol Middleton, pride was undeniable. Years of devotion had led to this extraordinary day. But alongside that pride came a quiet understanding, an awareness that the world her daughter had entered was not built for families like theirs. It was a system shaped over centuries, guided by traditions that did not easily bend. Within it, her place was carefully defined, appreciated, respected, but always at a distance. That feeling did not fade once the celebrations ended. Instead, it settled into the rhythm of palace life, growing more noticeable with time. By July 2013, when Prince George of Wales was born, joy returned in full force. Becoming a grandmother marked a deeply personal milestone, yet even this happiness came with quiet limits. The palace, ever mindful of structure, encouraged an approach to childcare that relied on precision, routine, and professional oversight. At the center of this approach were nannies trained at Norland College, an institution long trusted by the royal household. Their methods were polished, disciplined, and consistent with royal expectations. On the surface, this seemed reasonable, but beneath it, there were subtle lines, unspoken but clearly felt. What was offered as guidance often carried the weight of instruction, shaping not just how the children were raised, but who could take part in those early, intimate moments. Visits became structured. Time was arranged in advance, carefully measured, quietly observed. What might have been simple family closeness instead took on the tone of formality. Conversations unfolded in elegant rooms, affection expressed within invisible boundaries. Even small details, the choice of seat, the length of a visit, seemed gently directed by a system that valued order above all else. And so, the corridors of royal residences became familiar paths walked with mixed emotion. Each step carried both connection and distance. In public, everything appeared harmonious, a picture of unity admired across the world. In private, however, the experience could feel different, like standing in a place where you are always invited, yet never entirely free to belong. It is within that quiet contrast, between celebration and separation, closeness and control, that this story truly lives, hidden behind the polished surface of royal life. While public attention focused elsewhere, Carol Middleton remained completely silent, almost invisible amid the rising speculation. Was her restraint truly calm acceptance, or a calculated move shaped by something far deeper behind palace dynamics? And how did this quiet protection of Catherine hint at tensions the public was never meant to see? The silence that spoke, louder than power. And here is where the story shifts in a way few beyond palace walls ever truly noticed. While speculation swirled and attention fixated on public figures, Carol Middleton remained almost invisible in the noise. No interviews, no quiet leaks, no carefully placed allies speaking on her behalf. She chose restraint, but not because she felt nothing. Those who understand the inner workings of the royal circle describe her composure as deeply intentional, a quiet decision to protect her daughter, Catherine, at any cost. This was not a weakness. It was a calculated kind of strength. Carol understood the fragile balance of life inside the monarchy, where even the smallest ripple could unsettle years of careful positioning. Her silence became her shield, her way of ensuring that Catherine's place within the institution remained secure. It was a sacrifice that demanded patience, and for a long time, it held. But nothing within that world stays unchanged forever. By September 2022, everything familiar was suddenly redefined. The passing of Queen Elizabeth II did more than mark the end of an era. It reset the entire structure of influence within the royal family. With King Charles III ascending the throne and Camilla stepping into her role as Queen Consort, later recognized simply as Queen, the balance of power quietly shifted. Titles changed, but more importantly, so did tone. Prince William and Catherine took on their new roles as Prince and Princess of Wales, placing them closer than ever to the center of royal life. And as these positions solidified, so too did the presence of Queen Camilla, whose authority, once subtle, now carried undeniable weight. Observers suggest that this new confidence revealed itself not through dramatic gestures, but through small, precise moments, conversations that leaned heavily on tradition, subtle exclusions that needed no explanation, decisions about family matters, especially involving the grandchildren, that seemed to leave little room for outside voices, even those as close as Carol. To the untrained eye, nothing appeared unusual, but to those watching closely, the pattern was clear. The atmosphere had changed, and Carol's place within it felt increasingly defined by quiet distance rather than inclusion. What makes this story more compelling is what followed behind closed doors. In the weeks leading up to early 2026, insiders began to notice a shift that could no longer be dismissed as subtle. Private conversations reportedly grew sharper, more direct, carrying an edge rarely seen within such a carefully controlled environment. And at the center of it all stood Catherine, no longer just an observer, but someone increasingly aware of the tension surrounding the woman who had remained silent for so long. What if these small, almost invisible moments were never harmless at all? How did subtle shifts, quiet exclusions, strained family gatherings, and unnoticed distancing build into a pattern that redefined her place within the family and left deeper questions about what was really happening behind closed doors? The moment's silence could no longer hold. Quietly, almost unnoticed at first, the atmosphere had been shifting for years. What seemed like harmless moments, an awkward seat at a family dinner, a voice gently but firmly spoken over during a holiday discussion, began to gather weight. By the time these incidents formed a clear pattern, they were no longer easy to dismiss. At one gathering, she found herself placed at a distance from the children she adored, surrounded instead by unfamiliar faces, while others occupied the spaces closest to them. It was subtle, but it spoke volumes. These moments stretched across nearly 15 years, shaping a routine of quiet endurance. Suggestions about family matters were brushed aside, conversations redirected, and decisions made without her voice truly being heard. There were exchanges that carried a tone difficult to ignore, carefully worded, yet unmistakably dismissive. Staff present during one such conversation reportedly noticed the shift, their silence reflecting the discomfort that lingered in the room long after the words had been spoken. Then came a meeting in London, presented as nothing unusual. It was described as a routine discussion, the kind that often accompanied the evolving structure of a high-profile family. She arrived composed, as always, prepared for formality and restraint. The setting itself, filled with history, portraits, and an air of authority, seemed to echo the weight of what was about to unfold. What followed, according to those familiar with the exchange, marked a turning point. The conversation moved beyond polite boundaries, becoming something far more direct and personal. Remarks were made about her role, her presence, and even her background, framed not as harsh criticism, but as simple observations. Yet it was precisely that calm delivery that made them cut deeper. The implication was clear. Her place, her influence, and even her understanding of the world were being questioned. Through it all, she remained steady. Years of discipline had taught her how to listen without reacting, to absorb without revealing. She responded carefully, maintaining composure until the very end. But once outside, beneath the gray sky and away from watchful eyes, the weight of those words became impossible to ignore. She returned home in silence, taking time before speaking. When she finally did, choosing her moment with care, the conversation that followed would quietly reshape everything that had come before. When news of the sitting room moment reached Catherine, Princess of Wales, her reaction was not collapse but an unsettling stillness that even insiders couldn't decode. What shifted within her in that instant? And how did years of restraint transform into a new, calculated clarity by early 2026? The moment everything shifted, behind palace doors. When word finally reached Catherine, Princess of Wales, about what had unfolded in that quiet sitting room, something within her did not break. It settled. Those closest to her would later struggle to describe it, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was so controlled it felt unfamiliar. For over a decade, she had mastered composure in the public eye, turning restraint into second nature. Yet this was different. By early 2026, that calm had sharpened into something far more deliberate: clarity. She moved through the halls of her residence in silence that day, choosing distance over discussion. The staff noticed, but no one interrupted. There was no call placed to Prince William, no urgent consultation with palace advisors trained to soften crises behind closed doors. Instead, she stepped outside the system entirely, quietly assembling a small circle of independent legal minds, professionals whose loyalty belonged only to her. What followed was not rushed. Hours stretched into careful examination as she revisited not just a single moment, but a pattern shaped over years, nearly 15 of them. Subtle slights, quiet exclusions, and the quiet endurance of someone she loved had not gone unnoticed. Each detail was weighed, each memory placed into a larger picture that now, finally, made complete sense. But before any formal move was made, she chose a path few expected. She asked for a private meeting with Queen Camilla. Inside a formal drawing room deep within the palace, the atmosphere was unmistakably serious. This was not a space for polite exchanges. When the two women faced each other, the balance in the room had shifted in a way insiders later described as extraordinary. Catherine did not enter as someone seeking approval, nor as someone asking for understanding. She arrived with certainty. Those familiar with royal tradition might have expected diplomacy, perhaps even quiet compromise, but this moment carried none of that. It was not a negotiation. It was a declaration. What made it so powerful was not anger, it was control, the kind built slowly over years of observation, patience, and careful silence, the kind that chooses its moment with precision. For Catherine, that moment had arrived, and when she finally spoke, it was not to open a conversation, but to close a chapter that had been quietly unfolding for far longer than anyone outside those walls had ever realized. What truly unfolded behind palace walls when Catherine, Princess of Wales, chose restraint over confrontation? And how did her quiet focus on the institution itself shift the balance in a moment that would leave Queen Camilla facing consequences no one expected? When silence turned into strategy. What unfolded behind palace walls, according to those familiar with the moment, was not the kind of confrontation anyone had expected, and perhaps not one easily forgotten. The setting carried its usual calm, yet the atmosphere told a different story. Catherine, Princess of Wales, did not arrive with visible frustration or raised emotion. Instead, she chose a quieter, far more deliberate path, one that would soon leave a lasting impression on Queen Camilla. Rather than revisiting personal grievances or recounting difficult family experiences, Catherine reportedly leaned into something far more powerful: the institution itself. She spoke in the language that has defined the monarchy for generations: duty, respect, and the careful protection of those connected to it. It was a method that insiders later described as both unexpected and remarkably effective. Her tone remained steady, almost clinical, as she carefully aligned over 10 years of alleged treatment with the standards the royal household publicly claims to uphold. There were no sharp accusations, no emotional appeals that could be dismissed as personal sensitivity. Instead, what emerged was a structured argument, built piece by piece, leaving little room for deflection. Each point reportedly reflected not just personal concern, but a broader question about consistency, whether the values often presented to the public were truly being practiced behind closed doors. For a figure like Queen Camilla, whose presence has long been associated with quiet authority, the shift in dynamic was striking. Observers described her response as controlled but noticeably restrained, as though the usual tools of hierarchy and tradition offered little ground to stand on in that moment. Catherine, by avoiding confrontation in its typical form, had created something far more difficult to counter. The discussion, however, did not end with clear answers. No formal resolution emerged, and no visible concessions were made. On the surface, everything remained composed. Yet those close to the situation suggested that the impact lingered well beyond the room. There was, they claimed, a sense of discomfort, an unfamiliar pause in a system built on certainty. Then came an unexpected turn. Just 3 days later, the situation reportedly escalated in a way few could have predicted. A legal move surfaced, shifting what had been a private exchange into something with far wider implications. By early 2024, conversations surrounding the monarchy had already grown more complex, but this development pushed the matter into territory rarely seen within royal precedent. What made this moment so significant was not volume or drama, but precision. Catherine had not sought to disrupt the system outright. Instead, she had reflected it back, asking it to measure itself against its own ideals, and in doing so may have changed the tone of the conversation entirely. The British royal family has endured scandal, betrayal, and public outrage for generations, held together by discipline and loyalty to the crown. But what changed in early 2026, and what unseen shift threatened to disrupt an institution long protected by silence, tradition, and unbreakable restraint? When silence was no longer enough. The British royal family has survived storms that would have broken most institutions. Scandal, betrayal, and public outrage have come and gone, yet the system endured. held together by tradition, restraint, and an unspoken rule: protect the crown at all costs. For generations, that quiet discipline worked. Even in moments of private hurt, loyalty to the institution outweighed personal response. But in early 2026, something shifted in a way few could have predicted. At the center of it stood Catherine, Princess of Wales, a figure long associated with composure and careful duty. What made this moment remarkable was not rebellion, but precision. Instead of confronting tensions behind palace doors, she reportedly turned outward, toward the legal system that exists beyond royal tradition. It was a move that carried weight not just because of what it addressed, but because of what it represented. The reported filing did not appear rushed or emotional. Those familiar with its contents described something deliberate, built over time. Accounts suggested that concerns had stretched back years, gathering detail and testimony along the way. At its core were claims tied to remarks about Carol Middleton, remarks said to have crossed from private tension into public harm. Witness statements, documented interactions, and carefully compiled evidence reportedly formed the backbone of the case. Inside palace circles, the reaction was immediate and uneasy. The shock was not simply about the claims themselves, but about the method through which they surfaced. For an institution that has long depended on privacy as its primary shield, the introduction of a legal record changed the dynamic in a fundamental way. Once an issue enters that formal space, it no longer belongs solely to those within the palace walls. It becomes part of a structured system defined by visibility, procedure, and ultimately, accountability. That shift carried a deeper concern behind closed doors. If the matter were to move forward, the controlled silence that had long protected internal affairs could give way to public scrutiny. Details once confined to whispers, private meetings, and discreet conversations risked being examined in a setting where tradition and discretion offer no protection. In that sense, the unease was not only about what was being said, but about what could potentially be revealed next. Beyond the palace, the reaction unfolded quickly. Public sentiment, as reflected across media discussions in 2026, leaned strongly in Catherine's favor. The image was simple yet powerful: a daughter standing up for her mother. Titles and hierarchy faded into the background, replaced by a story many could understand without explanation. In that moment, the monarchy faced something unfamiliar. Not just criticism, but a narrative it could not quietly contain. A mother on the edge, a daughter refusing silence, and a centuries-old institution suddenly exposed to harsh scrutiny. What truly triggered this shift, and how did events by early 2024 push the palace into a situation it could no longer control or quietly contain? A royal rift unfolds beyond palace walls. A mother pushed to the edge, a daughter unwilling to stay quiet any longer, and a centuries-old institution suddenly forced into the bright, unforgiving light of public scrutiny. This was the moment everything shifted. By early 2024, what had long been managed behind closed doors began slipping into a space the palace could not easily control. Those closest to Camilla reportedly found themselves scrambling, their usual calm precision replaced by urgent discussions and uneasy calculations. Inside the palace, rooms once reserved for dignified state matters became the backdrop for tense strategy sessions. Legal minds, senior aides, and communications experts gathered, not to prevent a storm, but to measure how severe it might become. The familiar tools of quiet resolution, private conversations, carefully balanced hierarchies, and an unspoken agreement to protect the institution at all costs no longer held the same power. This time, the matter had moved beyond those walls into a legal arena where tradition offered little protection. What made the situation especially difficult was not just the accusation itself, but the way it had been presented. Catherine's legal team, according to insiders, had built something far stronger than vague claims. Their case was said to rest on detailed accounts, supported by individuals whose voices carried weight within palace circles. The possibility of such figures speaking openly, under oath, introduced a level of uncertainty rarely faced by the monarchy. It threatened to reveal aspects of royal life that had, until now, remained carefully hidden from public view. As these internal debates unfolded, the public response began to gather momentum. By the mid-2020s, There was already a growing demand for transparency and fairness, especially in situations involving power and influence. This case seemed to fit directly into that wider conversation. The experiences attributed to Carol Middleton, years marked by subtle distance, quiet exclusion, and remarks that questioned her place, were not seen as distant or abstract. Instead, they struck a chord, reflecting situations many people felt they understood on a personal level. For Camilla's advisors, the dilemma became increasingly clear. Fighting the claims openly risked drawing even more attention, potentially exposing details that could reshape public perception of the institution. Yet avoiding a public confrontation carried its own cost, raising questions that might linger even longer. Each option seemed to lead toward consequences that could not easily be contained. In the end, what made this moment so significant was not just the conflict itself, but the setting in which it unfolded. No longer confined to private corridors or carefully worded statements, it existed in a space where every move could be examined, questioned, and remembered. And in that space, the balance of control had quietly, but unmistakably, begun to change. What truly happened inside that silent room, where a single document changed everything in an instant, confirming allegations with no room for denial or reversal? And why did this precise legal statement carry consequences that would echo far beyond the royal household? A statement that changed the balance. The resolution, when it reportedly came, did not unfold through long talks or gentle compromise, but through a single, sharp moment inside a formal room where a table, a document, and silence carried more weight than speeches. No gradual shifting of positions was recorded, only a legal statement prepared with precision that left no room for retreat or reinterpretation. It confirmed that the actions described in the allegations had taken place and that harm had followed, now attached to the royal household's official voice in a way that could not be softened later. For Camilla, the signature placed on that page was described by insiders as a turning point in her reign, not because of lost influence alone, but because it marked a rare admission within an institution known for avoiding fault. In centuries of royal tradition, the idea of a queen publicly accepting institutional harm was almost unheard of, yet here it was, released through official channels after pressure quietly built around Catherine, whose push for legal accountability made delay more costly than resolution. The decision removed any space for slow negotiation, forcing an immediate settlement described as efficient but emotionally heavy. The outcome reached the public on a quiet morning in London, where newsrooms moved between disbelief and fascination as the statement circulated. Commentators struggled to frame it. A sitting queen had acknowledged wrongdoing toward a woman from Berkshire whose life had once seemed far removed from royal influence. The symbolism felt almost too precise, a shift in class, dignity, and authority unfolding in real time. Inside palace circles, however, reactions were divided. Some senior figures were unsettled by the use of external legal pressure on matters they believed should remain private. The long-standing principle of never complain, never explain had been tested, and although the result appeared effective, it left unease among traditionalists who valued internal control above public resolution. In the days that followed, Camilla continued her duties, appearing at scheduled events with steady composure. Yet something around her had changed. Authority no longer felt absolute in the same way. Insiders observed that while public appearances remained unchanged, private dynamics had shifted, and the sense of unquestioned authority within the family had been permanently adjusted by the events surrounding the statement and its aftermath, which no longer allowed earlier assumptions to stand. Unspoken reactions moved through the palace after a legal filing connected to Catherine surfaced in early 2026, shifting the atmosphere in unexpected ways. What long-buried pressures were finally being exposed, and why did insiders describe this moment not as chaos, but as a quiet release after years of silent strain within the institution? The quiet shift inside the palace. Unspoken reactions spread through the palace corridors after a legal filing connected to Catherine was made public in early 2026 in London, changing the atmosphere in ways few expected. At first, younger staff and long-serving aides observed patterns of pressure within the institution that had quietly built over years, and for them the moment felt less like conflict and more like release, a sudden easing of strain that had no longer been sustainable in private spaces. Not celebration, but relief shaped by recognition that long-ignored concerns were finally being addressed openly and with authority. Meanwhile, inside Berkshire, Carol Middleton reportedly faced the situation with deep confusion, not because she doubted her daughter, but because the scale of Catherine's response far exceeded anything she had ever anticipated. What was meant to be a private expression of concern, shared in search of comfort or quiet resolution, instead escalated into a more formal legal direction carrying institutional weight, scrutiny, and risk that fundamentally reshaped how she understood the matter unfolding around them. Over the subsequent weeks, Catherine maintained her public duties with steady composure, appearing at engagements across London and beyond, fulfilling expectations with calm consistency. Yet behind that composed exterior, there appeared to be a subtle internal shift, noted only by close observers. Her demeanor remained warm and approachable, but less deferential than before, suggesting a quiet recalibration in how she positioned herself within the royal framework. She no longer carried the habitual tone of over-apology often associated with her earlier public life, instead projecting a firmer, more assured sense of place that observers quietly described as transformative. Insiders suggested this change subtly altered dynamics within palace environments, where her presence began to command more direct attention and careful listening rather than automatic assumption. Discussions around her role reportedly took on a more measured tone, reflecting a new awareness of her influence. Meanwhile, legal commentators observing royal affairs argued that her decision to pursue external legal channels introduced a precedent that would be difficult to reverse, raising broader questions about institutional self-governance, boundaries, and modernization. Ultimately, what remained clear was that internal balances of influence had quietly shifted in ways not visible to the public eye, yet deeply felt within the monarchy itself, extending far beyond formal appearances and ceremonial expectations. What subtle shifts in royal behavior quietly changed everything around the Princess of Wales? And how did a series of restrained decisions, seen only by insiders, reshape the atmosphere at the very center of royal life, pointing back to a simple private moment between Catherine and Carol Middleton? A turning point behind palace walls. The informal codes, the unspoken rules, the quiet calibration of who defers to whom and when, are said to have shifted in ways visible to those close to the center of royal life. Insiders point less to grand confrontation and more to a sequence of restrained decisions that slowly altered the atmosphere around the Princess of Wales and her family. At the heart of it, observers often return to an ordinary image in a private setting: Catherine with her mother Carol, not performing duty, but simply existing through years of pressure together. Their bond, described as unchanged in affection yet deepened in meaning, is shaped by sacrifice on both sides. One quiet and prolonged, the other decisive and public. Carol is said to have stepped back from visibility for over 15 years, while Catherine in turn refused to accept that institutional comfort should outweigh personal dignity. The ripple effect reportedly became most apparent after a statement linked to Camilla circulated in London in early 2024, reshaping how certain relationships were publicly interpreted. Within Windsor and at the Wales residence, sources describe a moment of unusual clarity under a pale winter sky that felt almost symbolic in its stillness. It is here, they suggest, that Catherine's response becomes less about personal conflict and more about a broader question of what modern institutions owe to the people inside them. That question extends beyond one family, touching on how tradition and accountability coexist when values outside the palace evolve faster than those within it. What emerges, according to those reflecting on the situation, is not a loud revolution, but a quieter recalibration achieved through a single act of refusal. Catherine did not declare change. She enacted it, choosing in decisive terms not to accept conditions she believed undermined her family's standing. The consequence, insiders say, is a subtle but lasting shift in how authority is perceived by those entering the royal sphere in future years. In the aftermath, life continues in motion. Work resumes, duties are met, and public appearances proceed without interruption in London and across England. Yet the significance lingers in quieter moments, in conversations between mother and daughter, and in the way silence itself now feels different. It is a change that does not announce itself, but is understood, and it leaves behind a question that institutions may find impossible to ignore in the years and decades still ahead. So what do you think really pushed Camilla to allegedly insult Catherine's mother in public before suddenly filing a lawsuit immediately afterward? Stay tuned. We'd like to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to comment and subscribe.